And then I decided, no, I'm leaving.
Thank you, Harold. True supporter. Cool. Good evening, everyone. My name is Deane. I will be your moderator, host this evening. And welcome to It Takes a Village. This is a bit of a unique feature for us. But before I get into that, just a little bit of background. It Takes a Village is an initiative that was born from the Lolo initiative, and it's actually great to see some of the older Lolo faces around, which was started by Mikey Nice when she was around here. But basically, It Takes a Village is a platform where generally we discuss people's origin stories. So not necessarily the technical details of their work and professional lives, but where they came from and how it takes a village to be where you are today. But today we've got a special edition. It's our first ever panel discussion, which we thought was very relevant given the upcoming elections, and we had a lot of interest and queries from people about this topic, and so we decided to take the opportunity to bring together what we think are some interesting voices and opinions to share their insights into what is up and coming. Before we start, just a special thank you to RB Media, who will be live streaming the event on LinkedIn. So for those who are not with us here in person, welcome. And also to our sponsors for tonight's event, the Document Warehouse, we thank you. And yeah, we look forward to an interesting discussion. All of you should have received an invite of sorts or saw the bios online. So I'm not going to do long, elaborate introductions for our speakers. I think they can speak for themselves. So yeah, I think without further ado, I'd like to please invite our panelists onto stage.
You can sit in the middle, Rowland. You're more important than the rest of us. Huh? Cirrus. Moet ek nader aan jou sit? Rowland, where do you want to go?
These bikes not supposed to work.
These are just for the live streaming. Yeah.
That helps.
Alright. Can I just ask someone to switch off the projector back there? Thank you. Okay, so lucky me, I get to sit in the moderator seat, so I get to ask the questions that I like to ask. So the first question which I would like to pose to all of you this evening is a little bit on... Hello? Now everything is switched off. Hi? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, let's talk. Well, they're luckily mic'd up, so yeah. So basically, the first question for you guys is, what, in your opinion, are some of the driving forces and factors in this upcoming elections, not just from a economic and political perspective, but also in the minds of the voters as we see it? And why is this a unique election compared to our previous elections to date? Let's go with Christy first.
Well, let me start by saying I don't think it's that unique. I think we've been here before. There's certainly a different energy. And I think, as we will discuss, there are circumstances that are quite different from the past. So I think for me the key issue would be the extent to which the current circumstances in the country, economically specifically, plays a role in deciding or making people decide, one, to go and vote, and two, then for who to vote. And I think we will spend some time tonight debating the impact of that, and whether there is a predictability in this election if one considers the social structures in our society.
I do think that there might be a degree of uniqueness in this election in the sense that I don't live in the Namibia, so I might have missed it in the past, but to me it sounds like this is the first election that there is a real chance or an opportunity that you actually can effect regime change. We had it in South Africa, we had it in Botswana, we probably had it in Zimbabwe and Mozambique as well. But the likeliness that there could be another party rather than the liberation movement getting some sort of authority, either the presidency or the legislature, or both. That certainly makes it unique. I think as far as the minds of people is concerned, very difficult to map how people think and what determines the way that they vote, especially in Namibia, because we don't have a lot of information. In Botswana, the president was really, really surprised when he heard that he lost the election because there was no surveys, credible surveys, to warn them in advance of a swing of support away from the governing party. In Namibia, I think I've seen something that Rowland has written yesterday, something like a newsletter, I think you can identify it more clearly. And somewhere there he says that surveys that they have done clearly shows that there is a swing away from SWAPO, and it could be as much as up to 35%, 36% of the vote that they might retain. That's radical. It's radical stuff. If that's likely to happen. That makes it unique. On the question of why people change their vote, I think it was during the Bill Clinton campaign. I think it was this thing about, is the economy stupid? And I think I'm not saying that it's only economic variables that determine why people change their loyalty and change their vote. But the narrative quite often is embedded in economic interest, unemployment, corruption. If you take all the variables together, alienation, the absence of the state, you take all those different variables together and you put it in a bit of an index, you can map, I think, people's behavior easy. But I think it does start with the economy and then the narrative that evolves as a consequence of people's personal and local experiences.
Deane didn't do the welcoming I was expecting. I thought he was going to welcome you to the first event of White Guys Talk Politics. But clearly he didn't think that was quite the right way to pitch this. But I think it is quite interesting to ask us, the three of us sitting up here, to get into the minds of the average Namibian voter, because I think our lives are very, very different from the average Namibian voter. And so, but if we look at data, and if we look at, I'm not going to try to shrink the voter, if you don't mind. If you look at data, and the data that we have, I must disagree with Christiaan. I think that's why I was invited to be on the panel together, because share some views. So if we look at the data, out of this election, there's a lot of hugely different factors at play in this election when compared to 2 elections ago, 3 elections ago, etc. in our view. So the first thing that we like to point people to is the fact that in this election, the eligible voters in this election, 65% of them have no recollection of the pre-independence period. So this is not the same as 1 election ago, 2 elections ago. Because of the nature of our demographics, our population pyramid, the between elections, we're having something like 250 to 300,000 new young voters to the voter base, or to the eligible voter base. And if you just consider the implications of that, where in our previous election we had just over 800,000 to 830, 860, I can't remember off the top of my head, 1,000 voters, the number of new entrants, potential voters between elections is actually quite substantial as a percent of the total number of eligible voters. And so that's the first thing that's changed quite dramatically. The second thing is that in the previous election we had 4 or 5 relatively weak economic years, but I think that there was still a greater faith in the ruling party at that point that they'd be able to turn the situation around. So at that point, we had an economy that had actually done pretty well in terms of improving, and a party that had done pretty well in terms of improving material living conditions from independence up until 2014, 2015. It went in fits and starts, but the overall trend was positive. GDP per capita was growing, access to basic services had improved, et cetera, et cetera. But then from 2015 until now, for the layperson, the economy has gone nowhere. So the point on it's the economy stupid, I think, is very relevant. Christiaan and I disagree. We might box after this. I don't know. We haven't yet, but we'll see. But I think that the fact that you have this interesting combination of factors where now you have a big portion of the population that the existing ruling party hasn't really done that much for in terms of the improvements that they've experienced through their lives, and an economy that doesn't seem to be really gaining traction and creating jobs and improving the material living conditions of people in the future that they look towards, I think actually will have quite a big bearing in this election. There's a lot of other things at play as well. Like for the first time in a long time, I would say there are actually some credible alternatives for people to vote. We've been talking about this election, and specifically the demographics of it, since basically the last election, where we, like many others, were taken by surprise in terms of the quantum of the change. And the thing that we picked up is by far the biggest factors in that change, and again, I think Christiaan and I may disagree here, but the things that we picked up as by far the biggest factors in that change was a combination of, number one, the young voters, and number two, a deterioration in economic conditions. And we don't put as big a weighting on the fish oil scandal for Swapper's weak decline or weak performance in 2019 as in most others. And the reason that we say that is that we have a prior data point in 2014 where we saw this huge upswing in support for Swapper and for their candidate. And so you say, what explains that? If there's no, if economics isn't playing a role in voter behavior, then why, after the period of very strong economic performance that we'd see, did we see this big upswing in support? And is there perhaps a floor on that? Does it go back down to 70 only because of economic conditions, or can it fall further? And our view is that with younger voters that are less loyal to the incumbent party, there is a reasonable possibility that it can fall further. And then the final point that I'll just make on this is that we then go way back in history and we looked at all the elections from the first 89 election. And one of the questions that we were trying to answer for ourselves is, because Swapper actually did a pretty good job for that first 20, 25 years after independence, how much of the population that was voting for Swapper were loyalists, and how many were just sensible people saying, Swapper's doing a decent job, let's vote for them, and there isn't really much of an alternative. And we think that that was also a not insignificant portion of the voters in elections between 89 and 2014. So I think that this election is a lot more interesting than people realize.
Cool. I think just to create a little bit more context around this for myself, I think there was a phrase used as we were chatting yesterday in preparation for this, of this thing about the perfect storm. All these different factors that are coming together almost serendipitously at once, whether it be, the fact that we've just 6 months ago done voter registration, so we had a phenomenally high turnout. More young people, as you mentioned, 65%, who have no recollection of pre-independence times. The outcomes in Botswana and South Africa recently that will be in the minds of the Namibian voters, and the sort of thing of the devil you know versus the devil you don't. How do you think that is going to weigh on people here?
Are you asking me?
Why not?
Well, I think one needs to be very careful in looking at what happened in South Africa and just automatically compare it to what happened in Botswana, which is a very, very different system, both in terms of its social structures, but also in terms of its electoral system. Accidentally, the BDP already lost their first election in 2014 when they got 48% of the vote, but because of the first past the post system, they retained 62% of the seats. So what has happened now is that there was a big enough effort to deny them that kind of mechanical effect. For the last 2 cycles, they've already used that effect. So that, I think, is different. I think also the ANC had showed us that splits are ruling party killers. If ruling parties tend to keep together the flock, they don't necessarily lose parties or these kinds of votes. So there has to be a split in many ways if you look at South Africa, and it has to be a significant split, not this. SWAPO had split every election since probably 1998. And the pattern is that in the first election cycle after the split, that split party becomes the ruling, the official opposition. They hang around for another cycle and then they disappear. So we had Benulenga, COD, we had Hedipo Amutenya, and now we've got another set of splits. Now we've got 3 split parties, or 3 breakaway parties, all who had been within SWAPO. I think if SWAPO had experienced any form of split before this election, it would have been game over. The kind of context that Rowland talks about is true, but up to a point. We saw that in 2019, opposition parties did better in the economically better off regions. The ruling party did its best in the extremely poor regions. And that tells me there's another factor that sort of coordinates that vote. So just looking at past election results, if you run correlation analysis, the degree of ethnic fragmentation or diversity in a region predicts very, very accurately the vote size of the second largest party. The degree or the lack of ethnic diversity predicts very strongly the vote size of the largest party. Multi-ethnic regions do better with competition. They don't do well in areas where there's a lack of ethnic diversity. If you look at SWAPO's performance, across the country, they got at least 40% of the votes in each of the regions. They may not have won the regions, but they have a significant presence. The opposition parties that have developed, APP is another example of a breakaway party. It gets votes in 1 or 2 regions. LPM got most of its votes in 2 regions. So the PDM was the lucky recipient of a large number, over 100,000 IPC voters that voted for them as the largest or perceived largest opposition party, because IPC didn't contest the 2019 elections. They will lose those voters, I'm 100% sure of it. They are competing with Nudu for the same ethnic vote, and they're going to lose it. Nudu seems to be on the up. The Northwest is another sort of ethno-regional party. So in my view, I agree with Rowland, the economy matters, but it doesn't matter in the way that we think it should. This notion of retrospective voting and rewarding incumbents if the economy is done well, or punishing the incumbents if the economy is done bad, is a very American notion of voting, economic voting, Downs' theory of it at least. And I'm not saying ethnicity is what drives people, but it makes coordination a lot easier. It allows for different forms of social control. So even if voters in the central north is not motivated to say, I vote for SWAPO because it's an Oshibambu party, the party doesn't have to be. The outcome is ethnic, and it makes it difficult. Thus far, I don't think outside the urban areas in Oshana, any opposition party has made any meaningful inroads into that bloc. Oshana is interesting because of the urban content. Urbanization is a huge factor, and so is education. But those are what we call forces of modernization. They do change societies, but they do it over a very long period of time. And people tend to stick around, and maybe the argument is better the devil you know. But I think what we lack in understanding is exactly how people deal with these kinds of economic problems that they may have, and what kind of explanation do they provide themselves in one, understanding what happens to them, and second, what will change things. Another point which I think is very important is that this playing field is not equal. The ruling party has benefits that no other party has. For example, civil servants, which is a significant part of the ruling party's supporters, can use their vehicles for political purposes. It's written into the Public Service Act. You can also participate in politics. There's no reason for you not to be active within party structures. There's the argument around money. Where does money come from? So all those kinds of things, I believe, makes it really difficult for oppositions, especially oppositions that had no access to formal resources. IPC has no money. AR has no money, right? What do you do and how effective can you be when you have no money?
If I can, sorry.
Yeah, I think we would just change the question. I think that's
Yeah, I actually want to hear your opinion in contrast to what Christy has said, because I mean, just in another way as well, just we were speaking a little bit outside about how informed the general voters are, especially on these issues that we maybe take heavily into consideration. And I think you started making the point.
It's not about being informed, it's do you go to bed hungry? So I think it's not the right way to, I agree with the notion that, looking at economic conditions in a, highly esoteric economist type manner is foolish. But, I mean, to say, oh, well, has GDP per capita increased? This is a proxy for a whole lot of other things. If you look beneath the surface of the socioeconomic conditions in the country, and you can take whatever data you want. Tannen, our data guy, was going through the, also known as LinkedIn boy, was going through the recent census, and he wanted to write a report called Out of the Open. He couldn't find any good. Like literally. I mean, last night he was in cusp of tears telling me about how he can't write this report because there's no good. You can't actually find socioeconomic indicators that suggest that things are improving anywhere. And so you sit with this very complicated, you sit with a situation where you then have to say, well, do people just in perpetuity continue to vote the same way because that's how they've voted in the past? Or do they say things have been bad for so long, this 8-9 year period, that we need to make some kind of change? The other thing that I think is very relevant here that we seem to miss in terms of analyzing the data is that in the previous election, SWAPO got 65% of the vote. In the regional and local authority elections, SWAPO got 56% of the vote. The regional elections are a little bit different and probably shouldn't conflate the two too much. But that 65% of the vote, if you didn't want to vote for SWAPO in 2019, who did you vote for? You basically had to vote PDM, and for many people, PDM isn't actually an option. This time around, you have LPM, okay, they were there last time, but they were relatively unknown. You've got AI, you've got IPC as options as well. You've got all these young voters, 200,000 additional young people that have registered this time around, that weren't eligible to vote last time around. I've struggled to see that having gone and queued up to get a voter card, they now won't vote. have someone. But the idea that they will go and vote for the same thing that their parents voted for 35 years ago, I think is just a great stretch of the imagination. These are young people that in many instances have been unemployed for close to a decade. The statistics agency is hiding unemployment statistics because there's definitely not because these statistics are good, right? So the previous number that we had was 33.4% of the population was unemployed. And what I always like to tell people is the question that was asked to determine whether you were employed or not is have you worked for a cash or an in-kind income in the last week for more than an hour? And still, a third of the population slithers below that very, very low bar. So the material conditions for a large number of people is very good. And to think that they'll just vote the same way that their parents voted 35 years ago, I struggle to see it.
I want to return to the remark that Rowland made at the beginning, is three white upper middle class men trying to get into the heads of poor voters. Let me just, one of the things that I find very curious, and I've been talking about elections for most of my life, is not once tonight, turnout was mentioned. And in many elections, that determines the outcome. The expectation of the particular turnout, if it's high turnout, it influences certain cohorts to vote more actively, and it turns out to be less active. But it does tell you a lot about what could be happening if you know the turnout, and we don't know about that yet. I think last night you guys mentioned that it will probably be on the high side, since so many more people have registered. But the fact that more people are registered does not necessarily mean that you will have a high turnout. It's possible. The other thing about, if we talk about poorer areas and richer areas, in most of these Southern African states, liberation movements tend to hang on to their voting support in rural areas for longer than in urban areas. But if you look at urban areas and you take the informal settlements, which Namibia don't seem to have a lot.
You've not travelled far enough.
A third of the population lives in shacks.
What I'm saying is, if you arrive in Joburg, that's the first thing that you see. Is the last thing that you also see. I haven't seen one in Muntiget, and I've been to Katatura earlier, but I end up being to almost all Indiget. But it's not such a dominant feature of the geography of the area. But what I'm trying to say is, if you look at informal settlements, quite often, because people have different expectations. Because they have different expectations, their voting behavior is also different. And quite often, if they live in informal settlements, we've seen that that's where the stay-away vote comes from. Because that's the area where the state is absent, crime is more prolific, it's unsafe for people to, and the expectations are lower because they move to urban areas, and the mobility is immediately limited because there's no employment. If you have 40.2% or 41% unemployment, you inhibit the people's mobility in that particular area, and they're much more aware of it, as opposed to in rural areas where people have different expectations, and the pressure to be economically and socioeconomically mobile might be less, depending on the conditions that prevail in those areas. So I just think those complex nuances about why people vote, if we ask ourselves why do people vote a particular way, you have to take into consideration some of those factors, that, such as economic mobility. In America, if I can just refer to that quickly, I think the thing that quite a lot of people, analysts, post-facto miss is that the high interest rates in Europe and the high interest rates in America is, there's nothing that impoverishes the lower middle class and the working class as quickly as high interest rates, which come about usually as a consequence of increased inflation. And in South Africa, it's important inflation, and in America, it's inflation that's that come about as a consequence of what happened in the value and supply chains. But interest rates, that's a massive influence on how people behave, because it does impoverish them. They have less disposable income. So you have to look for those variables in an informal settlement in a rural area that determines people's behavior because of the immediate experiences. And you quite often would hear that people talk about unsophisticated voters, or voters that they vote for ethnic reasons. It's all nonsense. People have real, rational reasons why they vote and who they vote for. And if you ask them, they can explain it to you. I'm hesitant to accept theory that people vote because they're Uvambu, or people vote because they are colored, or people vote because they are white. that you have to get behind the real reason why people vote, but you have to take into consideration some of these other complicated factors that has to do with the immediate environment in which people live.
I think, Piet, while we have you talking, actually, I just want to ask you a question just about we have this government of national unity, or the coalition government that's now come up in South Africa. And I think a question on my mind about the quality of the opposition here in Namibia, in a comparison to someone like, or the party like the DA, who have had, decades of experience governing a large amount of people.
You
How
seem
is
to be
this?
making the assumption that there is good quality opposition. It's not. I'll tell you why it's not. I'll tell you why it's not. Ever since I can remember, and I always say this, if a poor black voter get up in the morning and he's fed up with the ANC and he's unemployed and he's destitute, alienated, left behind by the economy, and he get up that morning and he says, who do I vote for? The DA is not an option. A political party is only a good political party if you're an option, if you're an alternative to something else. And the DA, because of its insistence on being liberals, in a world where social democracy makes much more sense, where the state has to play a pertinent role in the lives of people, because they're impoverished, because they're alienated, because they've been elected for so many years, so many decades, you have to present an alternative. The DA goes out, they say, this is who we are. You can vote for us or you can leave it. What they should be saying is, you're the people. How can we represent your interests? They actually were a horrible opposition for many, many years in South Africa. But let me just quickly, I think, refer to what I think I think these two gentlemen they have all the knowledge, and I'm picking around in the dark here. But let me try. I think it's a good thing that the IPC has its roots, perhaps, in SWAPO. I think it's a good thing that Itula has its roots in SWAPO. If people get up in the morning and they want to vote for somebody, and I think in Namibia probably there was the same thing, that there was no alternative for many years. No real alternative to vote for. This is an incredibly important aspect of an election. Is there an alternative? I think it's possible for people to make that leap, that ideological leap, to something that's familiar, that do not abandon the liberation movement, that do not undermine the narrative of the liberation movement. I think that it makes it easier to get up and say, I'm going to vote for change today. You're not voting for regime change, you're just voting for change. And if you said, you guys said that it's possible that the SWAPO can drop as far as down to 35%. It's because it's, first of all, there's an alternative, and secondly, it's not something that you're not abandoning the values of your parents. You're not voting contrary to the revolutionary ideals of your parents. In fact, you're voting for change and for improvement of conditions. That, I think SWAPO, I think Rowland quite correctly stated, for many years they've done a good job. The ANC has done a tremendous job for about 20 years, and then they ruined it. But you can build on that, something that has been solid in the past, you can't stick the ties. I think you just easier move from the one political preference to another one.
Thank you. Christy, if I can ask you, just something that I hadn't applied my mind to in any way or form really before yesterday was this whole possibility of a runoff election. Could you maybe explain a little bit more about what this could mean and what it could look like?
Yeah, the Constitution requires the winning candidate for the presidency to have 50% plus one vote, so they need an absolute majority. In the case where nobody gets that, there is a second round of elections where the two dominant candidates, or candidates with the largest vote shares, has then to contest the second round, and all voters has to choose between those two. It's not a unique system. The French have theirs as part of their system anyway. So the French go and vote, and I think 3 candidates are then selected to go into a second round. So in France, there's this saying that the first round you vote for who you want, and the second round you vote to keep someone out. And pretty much that kind of strategic voting is then expected to take place here too. And I think the issue is that it's most likely a runoff between the SWAPO candidate and IPC candidate. I think the gap between the two will determine what the possibilities are of an opposition leader winning the presidency, whilst the party may not win the National Assembly, in which case you have this kind of relationship where the situation where the executive is under command of one party and the legislature is under command of another party. Now that complicates a lot of things, and this may be our version of a government of national unity, where deals have to be made in order to appoint a cabinet, but also to pass legislation and so forth. And we can speculate about the possibilities of that happening. I think it's perhaps a bigger option or a more likely option if there is change, that the change will be in that format rather than the idea that SWAPO would lose the National Assembly elections. I think there are a couple of things, though, which we need to touch upon. Rowland's made a lot about young voters. Thus far, that was the group of people who didn't vote, so they didn't pitch up. Voter turnout has dropped. We now have a new register, so no ghost voters, no dead citizens, nothing of that sort. But there's no guarantee that our voter turnout will be higher. It's likely to, but it's not guaranteed. What happened in the past is as soon as voter turnout goes down, the ruling party does worse. Does better? No, worse.
Worse.
If the vote turnout is up, the opposition does worse. So a higher turnout would most likely, if we look at historical facts, will most likely benefit the ruling party. I think one shouldn't, if you use social structures, one shouldn't sort of try and oversimplify it and say, I vote for somebody because he and I are from the same ethnic group. I think it's far more complex. And it would be very hard to build an argument. Even if you have 500,000 voters up north, they may have 500,000 different reasons for voting, motivations to go to the polls. But the outcome is very much the same. So it's not so much about what motivates people, it's about the way they coordinate their votes. And in that sort of context, it is a far easier job to do. So I think what will eventually bring about political change in this country, the kind that Rowland talks about, is urbanization. Urbanization means exposure to far more of the economic problems. As Piet says, poor people would rather stay away than adopt opposition. So we need to solve that conundrum. What makes an opposition party attractive? South Africa, again, MK split took 14% of the vote. Those were Zulu votes. If the ANC did not split, the election results would have been exactly the same as the previous one. The DA, with all that it's got, perhaps got, I think, 1% more votes as a party.
This election, they actually had 200,000 fewer votes than last time.
Yeah, well, but the turnout has come down as well. Yeah, so I think unless we have this kind of, and this is what's concerned me about the political parties, they most certainly didn't keep up with the forces of modernization. The changes in education, and it's interesting that if you look at some of the stuff that we had drawn from the Afrobarometer data, education does make a difference, but it only makes a difference in some areas, not all areas. There is this notion that young people who are unemployed, who are struggling to get by, do not progress into adulthood. They don't become taxpayers, they don't integrate into the economy as they should, they don't acquire assets, they don't set up families because they can't afford to do it. So that kind of economic vulnerability leaves them also politically vulnerable. The influence of those who fund their lives and their lifestyles have a far greater say over their autonomy than would have been the case if they all had jobs. So I think there are all kinds of subtle forces in different parts of the country that sort of plays a part when we look at the way people will vote. For me, the most sure way is to look at the past, right? And there's nothing in the past that suggests, for example, that a certain segment, what is it, about 30, 40% of the total voters population for Rose?
35%, 37%.
You put the two Ks, right?
Put the two Ks in and it goes to 45. So
Yeah.
it's 37 and it goes to 45.
Yeah. So that would be, as far as I'm concerned, that's where the real battle is. And the explanations of why people would dare change their votes, I think, holds the key to either following the scenario that Rowland is sketching or sort of bring us back to the status quo.
But if I can just add on to that, though, that one of the, so you can't add the two Ks because Kavango East no longer votes SWAPO, not as nowhere near like they used to, and Oshana no longer votes SWAPO like they used to. So you're actually down to 3 O's and 1 K, where it used to be 4 O's and 2 Ks. And then at the same time, you've seen enormous loss of support in urban areas, and you've seen a lot of loss in support in the south, where now there's a big swing towards LPN. So I think perhaps I've identified the source of our disagreements. In finance and forecasting world, it's this idea that the past isn't a perfect predictor of the future. And I think you're anchoring a bit too much to all of the history and what you've seen in those elections. I can't, and this is the thought experiment that I like to ask people to do around the presidential election, seeing as well on that topic. And in my mind, the question on the presidential election is basically, first round, is there going to be a runoff? Can Individual get 50%? And then the second round becomes very interesting, but let's start the thought experiment on the first one. So the thought experiment on the first one is, Geingob got 56% of the vote. We missed the runoff election in 2019 by less than 52,000 votes. So there's something in the region of 200,000 young people now that have got voter cards that didn't have voter cards back then. So sure, the voter turnout is usually quite weak amongst younger people, but we've already taken out a third of the 300,000 that could have got voter cards. So there's 200,000 that remain, and I assume that at least half of them will pitch up. Right? This is more than enough to swing an election, assuming everybody else votes the way that they did previously. So then the question becomes, those parties that voted in the last election that placed their cross wherever they placed their cross, or let's just look at the SWAPO candidate, they placed their cross next to Geingob. Will there be more people who are saying they want to vote for Ndaitwa than for Geingob? And will there be fewer people that said they want to vote for Geingob that will say now they want to vote for Ndaitwa? If you cast your skepticism aside for a moment and say, well, perhaps economic conditions have some bearing on people's decision to vote for the incumbents, or to protest vote against the incumbents, or perhaps even positively vote in favor of someone else. And I think certainly someone like Job will have some people voting for him because they actually want him. If you consider that, then my assessment would be that it's unlikely that many people that voted in the previous election for someone other than the SWAPO candidate will suddenly jump to SWAPO. And at the same time, I can see a situation in which some of the people that voted for SWAPO will now say, look, enough is enough. We gave you the benefit of the doubt after the first 5 years of economic weakness. But now, things are just getting worse and worse for me. I have to vote for something else. But even if you don't buy that argument, where let's say it's half of the, so half of, or a third of, half of a third of, or half of 2/3, so 1/3 of the 300,000 people that could have voted, that could have registered and then could have voted, actually turn up to vote, these young voters that haven't voted before. What would draw those voters towards indictment? And I struggle to find the reason there. Perhaps it is parental pressure or grandparental pressure or pressure from the grandmother that gives you some of the pension. I find it hard to believe. The other thing is that we have more and more urban, an ever bigger portion of the population is urban and not necessarily living with parents or grandparents who recall the liberation era. So I would say while those pressures may exist, I would doubt if they're as significant as you say. The last point I'll just make on the runoff scenario, which I think is interesting, is if you voted for one of the candidates, the presidential candidate who's not in the runoff. So our assumption is that there will be a runoff. Our assumption is that the runoff will be between Itulela and Ndayitwa. If you voted for Job, for McHenry, for Swartboy, where do you cast your vote in the second round? In my mind, people voting for Amukwanda, people voting for Swartboy are not people that are voting because they want the status quo. The same, I think, is probably true to some degree for PDM voters, and certainly many PDM voters, I think, are people that are, anything but SWAPO voters. And so in your runoff, you actually have a very interesting potential outcome, if it gets to that.
Yeah, if I could just say something about this. The last election, when there was a swing away from SWAPO and especially from Crouwcamp, is actually much more important, I think, than we can make it out to be now, because we've seen in many other systems that once people have jumped ship, once they voted for another party, they quite often, they don't go back to where they've been, not in large numbers in any case. But it does create a narrative, it creates momentum, which makes it possible for more people to jump the fence. That election, the fact that Crouwcamp did so badly, created the type of psychological atmosphere for people that it is possible to liberate yourself without affecting regime change. So I think that's an important election. The fact that they were changed, if that was just a repeat of previous elections, this one would have been a lot more difficult for opposition parties in Itulela. But the momentum was already there, I think, was partially created. But I think the important thing is that once the momentum starts, it moves in the right direction. And we haven't mentioned social media yet. And what fascinates me about social media in many other places is that the conversation that goes on there is quite often where people are become very critical of, say, the ruling party and of the political leadership. I'm not saying that social media has a determining effect on how people vote. But once people start with that conversation, I remember that 15 years ago, if you say something negative about the ANC, you will have been attacked for being racist, pro-apartheid, against the liberation of black people. Now, it's the norm to be critical of the leadership. It's the norm to be critical of the ruling party.
If you say something bad about SWAPO on social media here, very little will happen. If you say something positive about SWAPO, you're likely to have people jump.
Exactly. So that narrative, that changes the narrative in normal conversations between people as well. 20 years ago, it was impossible to criticize SWAPO and ANC. Now, it's always the norm on social media, and that affects the way that people think about things. It changed the boundaries of what is morally questionable and what is the justification of previous disposition or pejorative positions. It does change the narrative, and that, I think, moves, that together with that election, the previous one, I think moves the debate away from the past, the deep past, as an explanation of what's happening now.
So I think the last question that I want to ask before we open up to the floor here is just based on your individual predictions of what is going to happen in this election, and if you take the opportunity to sort of look into the crystal ball for the next 5 years and say what is going to happen based on your prediction politically, socially, and economically to our country.
No, let us start with a wise 1 year number.
Yeah, I think in terms of the outcome, my analysis says that there is a high likelihood of a runoff election for the presidency, but the ruling party will remain the majority party in the National Assembly. They will not remain with the same amount or the vote share will decline. But I think we're not ready or at that point where people will finally reject it. I think in terms of the runoff elections, as Rowland says, that's when it becomes really interesting. And I think a lot of the economic consequences will be tied to that kind of scenario where the executive and the legislature has to engage in deal making. I think the appointment of cabinet ministers will be interesting because that would sort of be crucial in order for legislation to be able to pass. I also think once we're into a runoff elections, we'll see the importance of small parties as parties with blackmail potential. Very small. If the gap is very small, the very small parties will become really important. And you may have a situation where, like the EFF, I think at some point wanted its second in charge to be the finance minister, and you can have these kinds of scenarios coming out. Yeah, so I think that to me would be a lot, or have a lot of impact on the economy. I think there is pressure because of economic development that is in the pipeline, but also because I think the population is reaching a point where we will perhaps not be as stable as we used to be. I think from the things that we see, the number of people who are disappearing from the system, that's disengaging, and I think the kinds of examples that we talk about on social media, and we accidentally had a discussion on some project findings today about this. You can see the social media warriors, but they all come from a cohort that has never had a very positive impact on voter turnout. It's the young people. They vote on Twitter, they don't go to the polls. But what you do see is a form of disengagement. But what we also see is like there is a growing sentiment against import of labor, refugees, all kinds of foreigners. And I think the expectations of the Namibian population around things like green hydrogen or oil has not been managed. If you ask the average Namibian, what do you think will change in your life? I think you will have sort of a very good understanding of what people expect to be happening to them. So those aspects, I think we're moving into some uncertainty, political uncertainty as well. It's always interesting if you look at what the ANC and the DA had to say about each other before the government of national unity, and then you have to sort of backtrack and say, well, yes, I call them a bunch of commies or whatever. Now they're not so bad because we have to get into bed together. And I think that kind of strategic positioning, I think some of the parties has already indicated that they're open to alliances. Maybe they're trying to anticipate the outcome. I know two very small opposition parties has already swapped their followers. You can take mine for this election, I'll take yours for the next one. But that's sort of very much what we call cartel-like behavior. It's not a political party. It is somebody who tries to manipulate its support in order to get a seat into parliament. I think the importance of small parties in whatever configuration we have will increase, even if you have one seat, because if the margins are small and deals have to be made, these small parties become the real parties that can make a difference. And depending on the turnout, I think you need about between 7,500 and 8,000 votes to have a seat in Parliament, and that may well drop if the voter turnout goes down. The enlargement of Parliament has further reduced that situation. So I think we have 21 parties that are contesting elections. If you look at, again, the past, most of them struggled to get 1,000 votes countrywide, but yet the next election they're still there and so on. So there's a lot of political noise, but I think that noise may become important depending on how we move past, if there is indeed a runoff.
Before you go, there's some things I want to touch on that I think these two upper-class white males avoid. I've read a little bit about the Spall candidate in Daipro today, and when you talk to people, the general very decent, intelligent, kind, well-informed individual, but uninspiring. I wonder what will be the consequences of a woman presidency of Namibia. Does it have an effect in this election? That's the one thing that I'm really wondering about. The second thing is, Rowland has written that they have done surveys which shows that SWAPO can go down to about 35%. If the people have done the surveys that I know, they know what they're doing. They know their shit, like they say in Afrikaans. Which means I do trust the surveys to a certain degree, that there must be significant reliability there. If that is, then you have to ask yourself the question, if they say 35%, even if they're wrong to some extent, you can't be wrong from 35% to 50%. It's unlikely they will be. So if I have to put money on it, I would say I will go with the two gentlemen that I know works on this service and Rowland, and I will say, well, it's very possible that SWAPO may even lose the legislature and go down to 40%, like what has happened in South Africa. And if that happens, then in Daitwa, it's impossible for her to retain the presidency of Namibia. And then you might have regime change in this country to some extent. But I would like to think about the fact.
So we actually do have a little bit of data on that. So broadly, at population level, people don't care. 87% of the population doesn't care. The problem is that the portion of the population that does care is a rural northern voter.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's a fine mic drop equivalent. I mean, I think the problem is that there is a portion of the population that cares, and it's part of what would be conventionally her base. So I don't think it's a material impact on the outcome, but where you have a tight race, then it could matter. So I wouldn't. It certainly doesn't feature in our base case of why. I mean, if you test, and I think Christie's done similar things, but if you test tolerance within the population, you actually find quite high degrees of tolerance. I think it's been going the wrong direction, if I remember correctly. But you do still test quite high degrees of tolerance. And I don't think Namibia is, but this is, again, where it gets interesting, right? So I was thinking now when you were talking about how to sort of sum up a bunch of things, but one of the key things that I think that you'll see in the National Assembly is fragmentation. So it's very difficult. I agree with Christy that it's hard to call the actual outcome on the National Assembly election. But what I am very confident of is that you'll have fragmentation. So we have, this time round, we have two new parties. We have one credible new party. Credible new parties, two, and one credible new presidential candidate. What I suspect is that you'll find, firstly, that the opposition parties will eat the food of the official opposition now, and I think PDM is going to start to disappear, break it to them like in a cruel manner. But yeah, so there I think is the first thing. So you'll see the other opposition parties eating some of what they currently have. I think that they'll chipping away at SWAPO. Whether they can take another 16 percentage points or more away from SWAPO is debatable. I have to be honest here, and I think it will happen. I struggle to see how SWAPO will stay above 50% as well. But in the National Assembly, you have a completely different setup for how you deal with fragmentation. You have to, between yourselves, behave like adults and say, come, let's work together. Whereas with the presidency, you have a different way of dealing with fragmentation, which is this runoff. And in a runoff, I think it might end up being extremely tight. And they're the likes of a president, where you have a November woman and a November man as the two potential candidates. it may just be enough. Your Herero voter bloc, for example, is going to heavily favor the man over the woman, amongst others.
And Afrikaners as well.
Yeah, Afrikaners as well, apparently. Whereas white liberals will favor the woman. So it might have an impact at that level.
There are only 5 of those.
Yeah, all 5 white liberals. All important is pretty but so from that perspective, I think basically the conclusion that I come to on all of this is that there's 4 potential scenarios. So the 4 potential scenarios are a SWAPO president or not, and then at the same time a SWAPO-controlled National Assembly or not. These are the 4 potential scenarios. And I think all 4 are still in play because of the potential runoff scenario. So you might have Ndaipo win a runoff, in which case you retain SWAPO presidency. I don't think she wins the first round. You might also have SWAPO just clinging on in the National Assembly. And there's 4 regions that I think are basically going to decide the election. So if those 4 regions, so 3 of the 4 O's and Kavango West, if those regions vote more than 70% for SWAPO, then SWAPO will stay in power most likely. And if they are below that, then I think SWAPO will lose power. 70% is a sure thing, 75 depends a little bit on what happens in the rest of it. But, so all 4 of those scenarios are in play, and I think two of them are actually very similar. So if you have a SWAPO presidency, irrespective of whether you have a SWAPO-controlled National Assembly or not, the power of the executive and the power of the president is such that it's easy to cobble together sufficient parliamentary support in order for SWAPO basically to largely continue as it is. So 2 of the 4 scenarios I think are very similar in that regard. And that's where SWAPO wins the presidency. And if you look at that, then that's largely a continuation of the status quo. And then I would suggest you cast your eyes to 2029. Now 2029 in all likelihood is the election at which we are either on the cusp of oil revenues or we've just started to receive oil revenues. And in the 5-year period between now and then, if the focus remains on oil and gas and hydrogen, we create no jobs. Don't believe the bullshit that you read about how many jobs hydrogen is going to create. It's nonsense. So we don't create sufficient jobs to improve the material living conditions of the average man. And then at the same time, you have this very fundamental problem, which is that your big revenues for oil and gas is still a little way away, so you don't have the means to redistribute through the public purse in order to improve people's lives dramatically over that period either. So come 29, you also then have 300,000 new young voters coming in. Come 29, what happens? SWAP was promising to create 500,000 jobs in the next 5 years. We looked at the numbers, that's 100,000 jobs on average per year over the next 5 years. We looked at the numbers this morning, created less than 10,000 jobs per year since independence. So a 10-fold increase. And the plan is mineral beneficiation. Now, we've done plentiful work on mineral beneficiation. And the reason that we're not doing mineral beneficiation in Namibia beyond the little bits and pieces that we are doing is because it's not viable. And if you force miners to add value to minerals, it's actually value in a non-competitive manner. It's actually value destructive. And the miners will leave the country. So you'll destroy jobs, not create jobs. And so there's no real idea behind creating jobs and improving people's lives. So in scenarios 1 and 2, let's say, you end up in a situation where come 2029, you have an election in which there's most likely an upset. But now you're on the cusp of oil and gas money. So then the questions of free and fair and so on become more pertinent. The other thing that I think is important to bear in mind in that regard is that, exactly as Piet said, I think that many of the people that are sort of running the show in SWAPO now are still very fundamentally decent people. They've run out of policy ideas. You know, you don't get great policy ideas out of Leningrad. They run out of policy ideas, and that's the problem. And then you've got a system. I was speaking to a minister yesterday. I had a very amusing conversation. If the piece that he refers to, I talked about how the problem that we have with hydrogen is not that hydrogen stuff is happening, but that there have been these enormous job promises which aren't materializing and won't materialize. But it's created this distraction that's allowed us to take our eye off other reforms, and especially the economic advisor to the president, to take his eye off other reforms that are badly needed in order to actually create jobs. And So I equate this to relying on one friend to bring the meat to the bride. And the friend keeps saying, yeah, they're going to bring the meat, don't worry. And then they pitch up at the bride with no meat. And I said, there's someone who understands. And I said, so now it's time to bride, and there's no meat. At best, we have yesterday's salad. So anyway, so now I'm sitting in a meeting, my phone keeps ringing. Eventually, I look through it, I say, shit, I'm going to get chewed out by this minister. Hang up, finish the meeting, sort of build up my strength to call him back, knowing that I'm going to get an earful. And I see he sent a message at the same time. He said, Brown, you are too right. We need meat, not salad. So anyway, then I spoke to him subsequently, and he was just complaining about how frustrating it is to try to get anything done. And I think this is one of the reform ministers who wants to change things for the better. But after 35 years, you have a system, and I see an ex-minister in the room, but you have a system that just makes it so hard to implement change that to see how the kind of potential reforms that we need can be introduced between now and 29 is hard. So I think from that perspective, you see a broad continuation of the status quo, but a big problem come 29. And then these decent, fundamentally decent swap amendments are, a little past the hill there, say. And then you have the next round. And in the next round, while there are some fundamentally decent people, there are also some proper crooks. They know who they are. So then you go into the other two scenarios, which are the scenarios where you either have a swapper controlled executive, swapper controlled legislature, or a non-swapper controlled legislature, and you have a non-swapper president. And that becomes an extremely complicated situation. That's where I think you need all of these sort of some form of coalition. You could theoretically have a National Assembly, so a legislative coalition of some sort, and have an executive that's just picked by the president, who in this instance would be most likely a Tula. We don't see that, were it to be a runoff between a job or a spot boy, or those are basically the only two options. They're too polarizing to actually win. So Tula's voters in those instances would most likely go back to Swapper or to Ndaitwa. So the only way that we would really see a non-swapper president would be if it was Tula. But there, again, I think you may have a situation in which you have it would really depend whether whether your executive work well with the National Assembly and whether the National Assembly or the legislature is willing to do the same in reverse. And again, if you go through party lists, I think if you look at the swapper party list, there's fundamentally decent people there that have national interests first. There's also some people that don't. But the majority, I would say, have national interests first. So I would say there probably is a way that you could cobble together something. And there would, in all likelihood, be a number of... If we overlay the swapper party list with the manifestos, you see a few people in the swapper party list that should be further in parties that are further left of them. But you also see quite a few people that should be further right. And further right, we're far from far right here, we're far from even center. But a number of people actually fit better into the IPC manifesto than into the swap manifesto companies that are currently on the swapper list. And I think those types of individuals could be very strategically supportive of something like a reform agenda driven by an IPC, with a view to obviously try to get power back come 29. But it's very, very difficult to say exactly how the legislature would play out. And that for us is probably the most interesting and the most sort of fearful situation. Then you have this potential for kingmakers. And the kingmakers, in all likelihood, the most significant kingmakers, but in all likelihood, be Swapboy and both of those kingmakers could drag the party quite a bit left where it currently is, which is definitely not what the country needs. So that's a potential policy risk.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I guess at some point I need to stop hogging the question mic. And we'll go to the floor. So, thank you, Deane.
Good evening. I've got two questions. The first one is, do you think we'll ever reach a point in our history as a nation where we move away from SWAPO or variations of SWAPO and move towards opposition or a coalition of opposition? The second question is fish rock. that aided Abel's legacy a lot, and it pulled a lot of protests in the other direction. Do you think that Nani Daito's presentation as uncorruptible or not part of anything that will actually have an effect? Thank you.
Speaking to guys, I don't live yet.
I think coalition politics is probably going to be with us if there is change, and going to be with us for a substantive period of time. That seems to be the global trend anyway, right? So a party with 40% of the vote is actually a very large party in different parts of the world. So I think it's tough to say. SWAPO goes into this election with a list of people, I think 60 of those, who's never been in the National Assembly. So there's a lot of inexperience. National Assembly seats belong to the party, not to the candidate. So it's a horrible system with which to implement very strict party discipline. So I think that also plays a part. I think in terms of where we're going with this, I'm more towards the scenario of 29 that Rowland talks about. I think change is inevitable. My disagreement is just that it will happen at this election. I think there's a lot that needs to happen for us to be able to predict. I think our political stability is definitely something that is becoming more and more fragile. I think there is a scenario where most people don't care about democracy as the system. I think there is a growing support among some circles for options that introduce changes in society by means of military interventions and not votes. So all those kinds of things, I think, will become part of the scenario once we have those changes in place. I think there is an impatience, but that's something that grows across Africa. The youth is finding new ways of participating. They may not participate in the elections to the extent that we want them to, but there are certainly new avenues for them. Protest is one of them. And again, we see a big upflow of youth-based protests in Africa. So I think we're entering also a scenario after this elections where the quality of democracy will be compromised, and we'll see some kind of backsliding of Namibia's democracy as we know it. We've already seen that the National Assembly is trying its best to circumvent the independence of the courts with legislative changes where it's trying to get rid of court rulings. Those kinds of things, if the legislature is fragmented, I think we'll have less of those. If the legislature remains united, we will see a lot more of those. I think intolerance is a real problem that we'll have to deal with. I might be speaking out of ignorance, so help me if I'm wrong, but I understand when the executive interferes in the legislative process, trying to influence the court. I never got the feeling in Namibia is enough revolutionary type of conditions prevailing for if SWAPO lose an election, that there will be significant violence. I simply don't get that feeling. In other words, you can change, SWAPO can lose this election, and something tells me it will be a major event, but not something that will destabilize politics to the extent that you have in Mozambique, for instance. I don't. Yeah, but that's not what I'm saying. No, I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm just asking, what are the chances for a revolutionary potential? It seems to be low in Namibia. I think there's a difference between revolution and protest. It's not a revolution by a long shot, but I do think you'll have. And again, if you buy Rowland's argument about how much people are suffering, at some point you expect some kind of action. I don't know what kind of action, whether it is the kind of action that you see in South Africa. And I don't think it will follow the election results. I think thus far the trend has been people accept the results, parties and so forth. I often ask the question whether SWAPO is willing to become the opposition party with the largest headquarters in Africa. There's a lot of investments into keeping this party in power. The question would be, how far will they stretch it? And I think we spoke a little bit about this last night. There won't be fiddling with the elections now. It's too late for that. I think if you wanted to fiddle, you had to do it during the registration process, maybe. So I think the outcome will be free and fair, and people will accept it as such. We're already in a very precarious situation with the last elections, where the use of the electronic voting machines without a paper trail was declared unconstitutional by the courts, but the courts stopped before saying the outcome was unconstitutional. The means of getting to the results was unconstitutional, but they didn't declare it. So I think those kinds of things have put people on edge. We see that trust in institutions across the continent and here specifically as well have deteriorated. My question is always, what does it mean? Are we seeing a segment of society, and a growing segment of society, that's becoming critical citizens? In other words, they become critical of what their government's doing. They speak out against things they don't feel comfortable with, and so on. But it doesn't mean to say that they want to change the system or disregard those who are in power. They are far more willing to confront and ask those difficult questions. And I think in a small community like Namibia, there are pockets where that is definitely taking place. But I also think if we just use our little simple indicator of whether somebody is committed to democracy and is willing to reject all other options of government, we've not created a great many more Democrats than what we did in 1999. So about 1/3 of the population would fall into those who says, I will always support democracy. I reject one-party rule, military rule, or any of those kinds of alternatives. So I think
that's a sign of patience. So democracy is a slow shift. A democratic system is an oil tank. It takes time to turn. And the fact that people are saying that they're tired of a system that's not working, rather than using the system to change things, is because they've run out of patience with the status quo. They want quick fixes.
Or simply they are no longer convinced that it works, that something else is better off. It could mean that they think the system is being manipulated, that it's not really the right kind of system. Either way, I think what we're entering politically is a far more uncertain period, where things that we took for granted, like Namibians want democracy, that is no longer as clear as it was a couple of years ago. And I think in that context, if there are political parties coming up, or agencies, extra political agencies, that starts articulating some of these problems, give a real definition as a youth reference group, they might find it easier to mobilize people than they did before.
Maybe there were two questions. So let me answer the second one as best I can, and I want to make a comment on the first as well. On the second one, why is I've certainly also experienced this perception that Guynevere was deeply marred by Fisher. But he personally wasn't involved. It happened before he was the president, officially. He wasn't the president, and the party did better than him in that election. Why would the smear primarily be on Guynevere rather than the party? And my answer to this, because it's a question we've been asked a lot, my answer to this, the best I can think of, is because there was actually a presidential alternative where there wasn't a party alternative. That's the best I can think of. On the first question about what happens, could you potentially have a coalition without SWAPO? In this election, I think it's so unlikely that SWAPO will get, terribly next to nothing, that I would say it's not really worth considering now. But if you do assume for a moment that SWAPO drops to as low as 35%, which, as I said, it's not base case, but assume that. The big question is, so there's 3 time questions that are interesting around this election. The first one is, if SWAPO loses, what do they do? Do they hand over power peacefully and so on? I'm on the same page as Christy here, where I think it's quite difficult not to. I mean, you have a president that's not planning on sticking around, a current president that's not planning on sticking around. You have a cabinet that gets its entire authority from the president, well, from the constitution, but president. So it's difficult, you know, I mean, and then you've got a whole bunch of ministers, or a fair number of ministers who realize that they're retiring or won't be in the National Assembly next year anyway. So practically what happens at that point is difficult to see how you would cling on to power. In our view, the risk period is actually between the first round and a runoff, if that happens. That's where we think that they could, that's where one would just, where the risk would be in our mind. And that could take multiple forms, but again, it's so far from base case, I'd prefer not to go into it. So the first question is short term. The next question is medium term, which is how does, say, a SWAPO at 35% behave in the National Assembly? So this is all totally theoretical, but how would it behave in a National Assembly? Would you have a constructive group trying to say, okay, well, let's put the country first, where we need to make sure that we get development and, you know, improve people's lives and so on? Or do you have a destructive force saying, let's make sure that whoever won doesn't get re-elected in 29? And either one of those options are quite plausible. Then the third period is the long term. How does this party then reform or change in order to secure votes long term and rise back to power at some point, knowing that an ever smaller percent of the population remembers the pre-independence period and places enormous value on the liberation era politics? So that last point about what happens to SWAPO if they lose significant support, I think is an extremely interesting one. And how does it reinvent itself? Does it reinvent itself? Or does it just continue to fragment and fragment and fragment, which I actually think the latter is quite possible. And in that scenario, then yeah, I think it's likely that into the future you see coalitions that don't necessarily include them.
Let me just ask you something. In South Africa, when the ANC lost the election, they had a strong leader in Ramaphosa who could take them across the river and say, the Rubicon, and say, we're going to cooperate with other political parties. And that doesn't strike me as somebody that can actually have the leadership to say, maybe she does, I don't know. But does he have the personality, the gravitas, the political experience, because somebody must take the lead. Say, well, this is where we are now, we lost an election, how will we behave now in the aftermath of this loss?
I have nothing bad to say about Ndaitwa. I think she's a very pleasant person.
But can she take you across the Rubicon, because that
well,
would be
let me answer it differently. So what I would say is that she, in all likelihood, will significantly underperform her party, to my view. In that instance, I think it's hard for you to be the credible leader of the party. And I would definitely not view her as the reformer within the party. There are other reformers within the party, and they are in different camps. So you have a camp, which I think is quite likely a direction in which the party could reform, which is with a number of, you know, not the most ethical and honest people. The problem with that is that that faction would likely be powerful within the party, but not popular within the nation. Then you have another faction, which is technocrat faction, which is more honest, and in all likelihood, more nationally popular, but less popular within the party. Technocrats are never popular, right? That's why we sit here with no friends. But technocrats are not popular, so not within that. Certainly not within the party. So from that perspective, there's I would say a high chance of fragmentation, because I can't see how, or jumping ship and changing sides. But I would say no, it's unlikely that if the party performs poorly in this election, that she'll be the reformer. I would be surprised.
Thank you very much for the great discussion. I have a question or rather a statement. Does the fact that Namibia is on the verge of getting the first female president have an influence on voters? Let's say women, liberal men, and the new eligible voters?
I can answer that because we have some data on it. Women voters are far more sexist than male voters. So I would say it's
And it's not only here, it's also in America. It's everywhere.
I think it's so weighty the issues that I'd like to stand when I make some comments. I won't ask questions, there are too many. But there are two major concerns that I picked up tonight that bother me very deeply and intensely. And nobody has really reflected on them. The one is that former national liberation movements run trajectories which then reach a point where they can no longer make the same moral claims to power that they made when we took independence. The question is SWAPO there, historically? If you look at the space in Namibia and you look at the temporal dimensions of our politics, one could argue that SWAPO is in the process of declining and losing the aura of a former liberation movement, losing it, hasn't lost it yet, but is busy losing that, and is becoming just another political party. If that is the case, then I think we talk different sets of scenarios. Because those national liberation movements are critically important, particularly when you have armed struggles followed by transitions to independence and some forms of democracy and state building and nation building. So they are necessary for the historical processes and the transitions to work, but inherently they are not equipped to govern complex societies. It's a statement which I know is hugely controversial, but it's fundamentally true. They are not equipped mentally, ideologically, in terms of their social capital that they have, to continue governing complex societies, particularly the complexities of this society and much of the region is currently facing and will face increasingly. So yes, historically they are there, they're necessary, but they are not sufficient conditions for democracy and democratic life. And that tension, I think, is now playing itself out in Namibia. Not only in Namibia, but also in many other contexts, including Zimbabwe, and of course Angola, Mozambique, and I would argue South Africa as well, in the case of the ANC. So the first question is, where are we historically in the broader scheme of things with SWAPO as a former liberation movement, albeit the most successful one, even going against the trends electorally for most other liberation movements in the region? Is that now past? Is that part of the glory of the past? Or will SWAPO be able to reinvent, to use your language itself, and move along and consolidate and build socially inclusive society and really get on with the business of governance in a very profound way? That's the first broad concern. The other concern that I have is that people talk about the IPC. But what is the IPC? The IPC is a new liberal party with a new liberal economy, and with an economy that is not fundamentally geared in terms of its thinking to address the social Namibian questions. It's fundamentally a status quo party. It likes liberal economics, it likes foreign fixed investment, it likes business to flourish, the ease of business. It's all about that. And that's status quo for many Namibians, particularly young Namibians. For them it's status quo. So Itula is no reformer. He's no reformer. He's taking a cue, and I hope he hears me, he's taking a cue from the DA in South Africa, saying if I position myself in the center of the political spectrum, I become a centrist movement, then I would be able to garner support and I would be able to build a type of broad-based coalition, which will not fundamentally change the structural features of the economy, nor address the deep crises that we have as a society. So there is no hope for me in Itula. I'm very clear about it. But is there hope in Spall? This is the more fundamental question. And with the current trends that we see, I don't have much hope in Spall either.
If I can just say one thing where I think you're wrong. If I can say one thing where I think you're wrong. The ANC, I'm not sure about Namibia. These guys are more experienced there. But in the ANC in the 1990s in South Africa, they put up the fastest growing black middle class of many modern economies. They created 9 million jobs. The economy was growing between 4 and 5.5%. 85% of people got electricity. Water water provision grew exponentially. They have done tremendously well for many years. The question is what went wrong. I can't say that the ANC couldn't govern well, or they didn't have the social capital, or they had bad intentions. Even some of the policies which we now know is ineffective at the time might have worked rather well. It just times have changed. So what I'm saying is to say that liberation movements are genetically not geared for good governance, I think that's completely wrong. It might be different in Namibia, I don't know. The question is what went wrong in the aftermath of a particular period. But in any case, they know more than I do.
What went wrong in Namibia? What went wrong is that we SWAPO morphed from a national liberation movement into a party state. That's what went wrong. The short answer, there are many more things to add to that. And that has been a major mistake. And that led to it that SWAPO developed a new elite, and that elite aggrandizement became the fundamental ideology. A materialist construct of politics, a materialist construction of the nation. That is what went wrong. And the elite themselves now are in trouble organically. There's an organic crisis beginning to emerge within the party. And the center in the politics can no longer hold. That's what went wrong. And the question is, how can that be, turned around? Is it possible to do that? Is it possible to innovate? Because I'm afraid, we don't have a political crisis. We have a crisis of politics.
Yeah,
that's what went wrong.
I think what you're saying about a party state is I think you're right. I think there is a search for a new sort of ideological tool where that kind of liberation struggle philosophy used to be. That is now served its traction. It's no longer appropriate. And I think this kind of developmental state, those kinds of discourses where a lot more emphasis is placed on the state, and you can see the strengthening, for example, of financial institutions within the state becomes a clear sign that sort of resource extraction becomes an important component. Why? Because the state, I think, is assumed, has almost become predatory in many respects. If you look at the lack of social development, those kinds of infrastructural things that sort of show in society that they're being looked after. But all dominant parties carry their own seeds of destruction within them. And by far, the majority of them lose power when they fracture. And fragmentation is on the cards when there's a long period of economic decline, when the party can no longer convince members that there's a sure chance of being elected. So there's a lot of doubt that's being put in. Normally there's sort of fragmentation around what is the best way to go. And if those kinds of forces can't be held together, that's invariably how it ends. It could take 72 years like in Mexico. It could take 42 years as in Sweden. But eventually, that's what happens. There's hardly an opposition party that starts up and then sort of outperforms the ruling party. There's always a split. The ruling party makes itself smaller, and by then opposition parties can find some way through. But I think if we look at sort of the introduction of a new type of, can I use the word authoritarianism in Africa, the benign dictator kind of model, there's certainly a lot of growing interest in that as a form of state building and of governance, where accountability is traded for economic gains. And it's, of course, a part of the problem with democracy is it allows contestation over things like the economy, and it's always difficult, or more difficult, to find sort of consensus than it is in somebody giving you a specific direction. I mean, the bureaucratic authoritarian regimes of South America in the 1970s is very much, I think, something that people are moving towards again.
So if I can just say one thing quickly. Let me just, since ideology is your bug, let me just give you, when South Africa grew at 5.5%, interest rates were low, inflation was low, we created the black middle class in 9 years of 6,500 people were added to the black middle class, 9,000 jobs were created. You know what was the ideology? Liberalism, neoliberalism. So people who say neoliberalism is the evil, is the reason for the decline in legitimacy, nonsense, bullshit. It saved the asses of the South African economy. The debt to GDP was below 25%. There was a budget surplus year on year on year on the Trevor Manual, and it was called a gear policy, so-called neoliberalism. That nonsense, ideological nonsense of that liberalism or neoliberalism or liberal market economics don't create wealth is nonsense, bullshit. Don't believe it.
You have a sample of one.
Okay.
South Africa is a sample of one.
No, it's not. It's not. I can show you many examples. I can show you many examples of exactly the same thing. Yeah, but you do try to, pejoratively speaking of liberal economics.
There'll be lots of time afterwards to discuss debates and things like this over a whiskey, I'm sure.
You still want to say something else? So, I mean, I'm sorry first to hear that you are so hopeless. That's a terrible thing to hear. It's very interesting comments to make on Itula specifically. So I've heard the full spectrum, I think, on him. Yours is now completes it, because that's the one position I haven't heard on him. Prior to this, I think I've heard everything else, but probably the most common is that he's authoritarian. That, one must be a bit careful because he could potentially be dictatorial. I don't know the fellow well, I've met him a couple of times, but the impression that he gives is not one of an authoritarian. He's, in these handful of meetings, he's, I think, clearly extremely intelligent. Rattle off numbers rather well. Clearly got a good memory and knows the Constitution rather well. But also, I mean, if I look at the manifestos, and we've done a lot of work on the manifestos, and it is really the standout manifesto in terms of consistency. The other manifestos are, I mean, three of the five major parties have extraordinarily schizophrenic manifestos that jump around all over the place. Yes, but it's hard to pin some of them down. I mean, okay, there's the space cadets at one of these satellites, which is interesting. But I mean, you've got every economic ideology contained within 2 lines of each other in many of these manifestos. So, whereas with what I've noted in the IPC one is that it's fairly consistent at least, and it seems to be centered around this idea that jobs need to be created. And quite frankly, when you look at the human suffering that exists in this country, job creation is absolutely fundamental to sorting it out. At the moment, we estimate that there's something in the region of 700,000 employed people in the country, at best. That's 700,000, and that includes 100,000 people employed in subsistence agriculture. So in terms of like salaried earning people, it's probably closer to 400,000, maybe 450 I'd push. And this very small group is supporting the rest of the country. It's paying all the tax, or almost all of the as well. So it's supporting directly and indirectly all the country. This is like a blatantly unsustainable situation that we sit with. And to see a little bit of policy coherence and a little bit of ideological coherence in a manifesto is an absolute breath of fresh air. I mean, I must, politely as I can, disagree with you in terms of that.
I think I'd like to give the opportunity just for one more question, because I know there's a lot of questions still to be asked. So, Chantal, just know, guys, there are snacks afterwards, so you don't have to run home to go eat. Like, there's a lot of opportunity here for conversation and things like that. So, yeah. Okay, we can take a couple more then.
I did not know that my question was going to be the last one from the night.
Yeah, we can do one or two more, maybe it's 15.
Okay, so I came here tonight hoping to get clarity on who on earth I'm going to vote for. I really enjoyed the conversation, but I have no further information to help me with my decision. I represent myself, and I'm not sure how many of the 3 million Namibians I represent. I've never not voted in my life, but I've never been into politics at all. My perception of politics is that it's a lot of talking, somewhat some drama, and really the one who plays the best is the one who gets the seat. So I want to know from you, where should I go to find the information that I need to make an informed decision? So I've watched Namibia for a while now, and I've seen in 2024, I have not heard more positive news about Namibia. And some of that news is hydrogen and oil and the promised jobs. And of course, what we've understood tonight is a lot of that is politics and not boots on the ground. And so I'm a little bit uncertain because my vote, and I've never been public about my politics. I've always understood that, Jesus was crucified because he spoke too much. So I've never done public politicking. But I'm sitting with a question here tonight where I'm going, like, I want to believe in Spall, and I've seen incredible African metrics and global metrics. Namibia is the belle of the ball. Who doesn't want to be here? The next 10 years looks incredible, and I couldn't be a proud Namibian, and I couldn't be more invested in the future of Namibia for the fact that I stay at home. But I feel like it's a lucky packet draw.
I'm going to be moderator and say, is the question, who should you vote for?
The question is, who should I vote for, and where do I go to find information for that?
You go to the Cirrus website, or you speak to these gents at the front, and they've done lots of manifesto assessments and can tell you a lot about the parties, and then you vote Swapa, obviously.
No, I think when we were asked to be here tonight, one of the things we were told is it's not a political discussion in the sense that we inform people what they should be voting for, who they should be voting for. You probably get some more information and some understanding of what's going on. But you are the voter. You have to make the decision. You cannot transfer the burden of that decision to us. You have to make the decision. You sound informed as it is. We might have added or not have added to your knowledge and your understanding of what's going on. But you have to make the decision yourself. Don't ask me who you should vote for. I'm not here to tell you that.
But there's lots of information available on our website, on the IPPR website, etc. So you can go and read the manifestos or listen to the speeches or whatever.
But I think there's something interesting, and that is how people have used their votes. And that has definitely changed in the last 2 elections, I'd say. So whereas in the past, voting was seen as a registration of support or loyalty, that has certainly changed. So people have split their tickets between voting for one presidential candidate and a different party. You can do that. There's nothing against it. And we've seen it. So, for example, PDM was much more popular than its presidential candidate. SWAPO lost a lot of presidential votes, but not necessarily lost the same amount of votes on the parties. So there is that kind of strategic objective. And I don't want to sound like an academic because I'm not one, but your problem is typical of voters. And that's that coordination problem. If we knew how everybody else in this room would vote, we could coordinate to appoint a winner that is more or less a compromise position between all of us, but we don't. So we go to the polls not wanting to waste our vote, but the information you're looking for may not be the same information that the other voters are looking for. So in that sense, it is a complex problem. Did I help you?
Who are you going to vote for now?
Good.
It's a question I get asked every day, no matter where I go. My family's gone so far as to make notes, write it down on paper or put it on their phones because they keep on forgetting what I'm saying.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity and Deane and team. Thank you for putting together an opportunity like this for us to engage. I have a lot of appreciation for Christiaan and what he said. And my question, and part of it, more than a comment, is do you think that SWAPO is fragmented? And borrowing from what the panel was discussing, saying that ruling parties tend to lose power because they become smaller. And seeing that Itula is a former SWAPO member, do we believe that he's strongly rooted in the SWAPO philosophy and tradition that he would cause chaos and havoc similar to that of Jacob Zuma?
I wouldn't equate him with Zuma, but let me tell you what I think is interesting. If you take Botswana as an ethnically homogeneous society, where opposition develops, it develops within the main ethnic group. So it negates, to a large extent, the importance of ethnicity, because everybody is from the same ethnic group, and you feel free to contest on economic issues, which I think is what has caused the change in Botswana. Botswana had, for a long period of time, made very sensible economic decisions. It was known to do that, and after the departure of Ian Khama, there was a whole lot of shaking up happening. I think in this case, eventually people will all go to a point where they say change is necessary. Once that happens, the change is quite quickly. So should SWAPO lose an election, the chances are within 10 years that party will disappear. That's what's going to happen to the BDP. As I said, it lost its first election in 2014. It just hung on in 2019, it's gone, right? So that kind of scenario is very likely if we look at what happens elsewhere. I also think that these large parties develop way too many fragments to keep together forever. It's inevitable they'll split. And it's inevitable that there will be within contestation about things like, should we go this way with the economy, should we go that way? I think the point that Rowland makes about oil and gas is an interesting one. I personally think the government is going to borrow money as soon as things become clearer, and that's going to fund some of the programs before the oil and gas actually comes on board, which is a highly risky proposition. But I think there's enough desperation for that kind of action to be taken.
Maybe an addition on that is, Andre asked, what is IPC? And in my mind, the same question applies to a post-liberation era SWAPO. What is it? And I don't think that there is this sort of unifying force anymore. And one of the reasons that Namibia has done okay, but not brilliantly, but not terribly, is because SWAPO has never been politically, ideologically unified. So there's always been breaks. It's never been able, and we've talked now for years about how Namibia never had policy direction, it has policy drift. Because you can never go in a pro-business direction because there's too many people that believe that that's a terrible idea, and you can't go in a very anti-business direction either because there's too many people that believe that's a bad idea. So it doesn't have an ideological foundation, which is generally what a sort of political or economic ideology. That's generally what parties form out of, or what parties cling together by. And SWAPO doesn't have that. So the big question in my mind would be how does a post-liberation era SWAPO actually, what does it hang its identity on? And I can't see what that is.
Yeah, but I think it's always
very
been.
intentional.
I think it's something that was born during the Cold War, the ability to play both sides of the ideological divide, almost a kind of schizophrenia, which is sort of quite acceptable, seeing that you have to generate support from the West or the communists. I think the issue, though, in terms of ideology, is that we tend to think parties need ideologies. SWAPO, the battle for liberation, was a battle for self-determination. It wasn't a battle for liberal democracy. It wasn't a battle for all these things. Those contents, including the electoral system, for example, was already the product of Western inputs into the kind of system they wanted to see. SWAPO was never attached to that kind of system. And I think what has happened at independence, there was a trade-off. Those who controlled the economy said, leave us alone, we'll run the economy, you can run politics. And I think over time, the state has started to reach over and say, we want the economy as well. So you start seeing these kinds of ideological components in terms of affirmative action, these investment bills and all these kinds of things that tends to create chaos in the mind of somebody who wants sort of a clear economic direction. And I think, there are fractions within the party. I think those fractions may or may not differ ideologically, but I think they all have a big difference, and those differences may be in terms of the economy and in terms of the state, and specifically how the state should be used in terms of either shaping the economy or sort of staying out of the economy. And that I don't see as a conflict between liberal economics or socialism or any of those things. I think those are all pragmatic choices. The state features very importantly in the fractions that support SWAPO, whether it's through the tendering process, whether it is through a salary structure, job security, all those kinds of things, I think play a massive part. If you don't have access to the state, you have access to very little. And I think ultimately within the ruling party, that is going to be the area where they're going to contest it. You call it technocrats. If you want to cut the public wage bill, how are you going to justify it? Because I think that would be an immediate way of turning away how many civil servants and give them to the opposition, because they will seek redemption.
So if I may just say, I'm always nervous when we talk about the ideology and ideological shifts that political parties make. Sometimes it's better to analyze what's happening in terms of good or bad policies. What is happening I think in many economies, and certainly in South Africa, is there's a form of call it a form of encroachment of the political elites on control or greater control of the economy. They intervene in the economy. It doesn't mean that they become socialist. It doesn't help you to understand if you explain it in terms of ideology. The efficiency of the economy is best managed when the state has a well-structured regulatory system and allow the economy to, through competitive means, produce the greatest outcome to the greatest number. That doesn't mean it's an ideological shift that the state makes. When they start to intervene in the economy, it's a matter of inefficiencies that they introduce into the economic system and into markets. I'm not saying you can't relate this as a form of ideological shift, but it doesn't help you to understand it. I think it's more better to look at it as bad or good policies in terms of the requirements of the market's efficiency, the likeliness of attracting foreign investment in a particular market, the likeliness of alienating or becoming uncompetitive. I think it sounds neoliberal, but if you use those concepts, the likeliness of your understanding what the state is doing, that's bad for the economy, that makes it impossible to create jobs, that undermine the value chains and supply chains efficiency. I think one must be careful to use ideology as a means of explanation.
But ideology is a backfill. right?
Is it?
Ideology is a backfill. So your policy is what, if you talk about policy, you say, these are my policies. You can fit that onto an ideology to some extent as a backfill. But to say that, this party's ideology is X, that's a different story. And I mean, I think that this is where you have think tanks, then you can say our think tank is a classical liberal think tank or something like that. And it can be an ideological, it can have ideological direction. But I agree with you that policy is actually what you look at. And then you backfill the ideology where you say this is this. But where I want to disagree with you is so you say government interference in a market economy or in the private sector, let's say, is not strictly Marxism. So I have a friend who you probably know who talks about Marxism 2.0. He says Marxism 1.0 was owning the means of production, Marxism 2.0 is controlling the means of production. And that's actually what you see in these economies. Where governments have tried, where the Namibian government, your own government has tried to run entities in the sort of corporate space, it's been disastrous. And so there's been this shift away from owning and running to controlling, pulling the levers, and that's got exactly the same detrimental long-term impacts on investment as does government controlling directly.
Just give you an example. For instance, the post office they gave it to Mark Barnes to manage the post office. He increased the asset base to 65% in a matter of 2 to 3 years. After about 4 to 5 years, they didn't need to ask government for a bailout. It was still controlled by the state, but it was managed more efficiently. So if you manage it more efficiently, even though it's controlled by it's a state-owned enterprise, is it socialism? No, it's not.
But it's ever less controlled by the state. So you've got Mark Barnes, who previously is Easy Equities and these things. Yeah. He's a free market guy. He goes in there, tells the state, don't interfere too much, and I'll make it work.
Yeah, but it's owned by the state. It's still owned by the state, but it's managed in a more efficient manner. So that's similar to our diamond
company, our Land Level Dev Marine, same kind of concept, right? It's government owned, or largely government owned, but there's limited interference. And that's almost true of all of the successful SOEs that we have. So the state maybe owns it, but it doesn't...
Something is not badly managed just because it's owned by the state. It can be well managed and owned by the state. And it doesn't make it ideological. But anyway,
could I ask you guys maybe if you'd like to make one last parting comment?
Sorry for cutting. I know one of those you mentioned is 2 guys, so I know we will also not have the time to engage these 2 guys, but I think I will appreciate if they can share their thoughts since they've been doing their exercise and so forth. So sorry to be disrespectful, but I really want to hear what they have to say. So the rest of them we can, also hear, and then we can further engage outside, but please give us the opportunity. Thank you very much.
For those of you who would like to stay and listen to their thoughts, you're welcome to. For those of you guys who would like to continue chatting outside, you're also welcome to.
You're a very lenient moderator.
Yeah, I know. I'm not very good at this at all.